This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And it's part 2 of this mini-series on What About China, where I do my best with my fellow podcaster and friend Jordan Schneider to tell in 3 brief episodes the story of what at some points has been a quarter of humanity, the quarter of humanity living on the soil that we call China. In part 1, we covered the long stretch, the long arc of Chinese history, stretching all the way from early imperial times to 1949, when the Communist Party, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, takes over. Don't worry if you haven't listened to that episode. I think it's really worth doing if you haven't. But if you want to just listen from here, we do give a quick summary of that in the very beginning of the conversation. This conversation takes us through the turbulent years under first Mao Zedong and then the reform period, especially the 80s, all the way to the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. This is, of course, a fascinating part of not only China's history, but I think world history. It is one of the greatest failed experiments in Soviet-style communism under Mao. And it sees one of the most remarkable economic transformations of a country, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of dire poverty. And this is really the story that makes China from the country that American parents tell their kids about, saying you should finish your food because there are people starving in China, to the country that we know today, where I've lived very comfortably myself and where so many of my friends still live and are doing well. There's going to be a fair amount of Chinese names in this conversation, which if you're not familiar with them, it might feel a bit overwhelming. Don't worry, you can let most of them slip by without really losing much. But aside of Mao and, of course, Deng Xiaoping, who was the great architect of Chinese opening up, I do want to highlight one character whose name comes up a lot, and it's easy to just not pay much attention. But I highly recommend that you do. That person is Zhao Ziyang, who was actually the top-ranking #1 person in the whole Chinese Communist Party during the Tiananmen Square massacre. He was chairman, the same role as Mao Zedong famously held. And now, I think why he's such an interesting character is not just because he was one of the most important economic reformers after the Mao era, but also because, and this is something that many people outside of China and inside of China do not know, he was also firmly against inviting the military to deal with the protest happening in Tiananmen Square. He actually had to live his rest of his life in house arrest, having been in the wrong side of history, so to speak. If you want to read more about that, he actually was able to smuggle out memoirs from his house arrest. They're called Enemy of the State. So that's one name to look for, is Zhao Ziyang. But anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. There will be a short part 3 after this, which will cover the era under Xi Jinping and speculate on China's future. That would be a little bit shorter and it will be out in just a couple of days. Stay tuned. But for now, let's focus on the really remarkable years under Mao Zedong and after them, especially 1980s. As always, there are helpful things in the show notes, like list of Chinese names that we mentioned that you can use if you feel a bit lost. And as always, if you do enjoy this conversation, then do please consider showing your support. Subscribe to the show, give me 5 stars if you think I deserve it. And finally, thank you so much to all the Patreon supporters who do actually show sustained financial support. That really makes a big difference. If you're a long-term supporter and you want to do that, you can head to patreon.com/onhumans and you can pledge a small sum there. That will make me really happy and we can have a little chat. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. I bring to you Yasheng Huang with my friend Jordan Schneider.
Part 2 with Yasheng Huang. We left it off in 1949. Ilari, why don't you give us a brief recap of our first episode?
To understand China's history, Yasheng Huang, what you're saying is we must focus on the little studied, little appreciated period after the collapse of the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century. And that during the next few centuries after this, China looks surprisingly like Europe, with no one power base, with a lot of competing ideologies. And your studies have shown that this is actually also when China was at its most inventive. But unlike Europe, this political fragmentation comes to an end. China is unified again in the 6th century under the Sui dynasty. And everything changes because with the Sui dynasty comes civil service exams on a large basis. And these work relatively well, you say. They allow a large majority of the population to participate. They work well in that they create stability. They create a sense for a lot of Chinese that if they really work hard, they can contribute, they can get political power. You don't get European-style aristocracy, but what you do get is you get an other cause, which is that all the intellectual efforts in China are sucked into this one funnel, and this funnel ultimately serves the emperor. And so there is no Henry VIII versus the Pope kind of power struggle. There is no Enlightenment style intelligentsia. There are just a lot of confusion educated civil servants. With this imperial tradition, what does Mao take and what does Mao reject when he starts to rule in 1949?
Yeah, thank you. That was a very good summary. Mao took over China in 1949. In some ways, he definitely inherited the autocratic aspect of the imperial China in terms of autocratic controls, plus very strong economic controls, right? Controls of the economy, central planning, state ownership, price setting by the government. And so I would argue that politically, Communist China went beyond the imperial China. The power of the imperial China, of the central court, never kind of reached beyond the county level. Under Communist China, that went even further than the county level, all the way to the village, first through the land reforms, the communist system. So that was a very much in the tradition of the imperial China, extended beyond the boundary of the political boundary of the imperial China. In another way, he actively went against imperial tradition in the sense of de-emphasizing bureaucracy and meritocracy, right? So that began in one form in 1957, but really all the way in 1966, the Cultural Revolution, and that was the whole period when China closed down its universities, de-emphasized examination and meritocracy and expertise, right? Elevated ideology, and that was a sharp departure. Not in terms of the emphasis of ideology, that was true in the imperial China, but just a very different mechanism, not through the exam system, but through political studies, ideological studies. That pretty much kind of captured both the continuity under Mao with the imperial China and a sharp departure from it.
Yeah, it's interesting because you make this argument, which I think is very convincing, which is that like the more, could-you-ified a system you have and the fewer power bases that exist, the more important like what the leader does actually matters. But I think it's also fair to say that like even a very powerful, Ming Dynasty or Song Dynasty emperor couldn't quite have executed like just the amount of crazy stuff that Mao was able to get into starting in the mid 50s and then through the end of his reign. So, he almost did the worst of both worlds where he had all the power centralized in him as a person, but none of the bureaucracy and like cultural, backlighting that would have made stuff like, the Great Leap Forward or Cultural Revolution impossible to actually, follow through on.
Yeah, so that's an excellent observation, Jordan. I should add maybe two more things. One is obviously the difference is modernity, right? So the imperial China couldn't rely on modern means of transportation, modern means of communication. And essentially the human capital indoctrination was the only thing that you had. And once you dispatch these officials to the remote regions, you kind of lost control over them, right? Whereas under the modern system, the control can be instantaneous and ongoing, right? You can fly back and forth, you can take the train, you can take the bus to Beijing to receive indoctrination. So that's technology makes the ruling and the extension of the central control fundamentally more far-reaching than before. And the other difference is that imperial China, like many other traditional polities, was happy with status quo. They didn't want, incredible transformation, but very often they didn't even know what that transformation was and didn't really know how to kind of preempt. So they kind of wanted to keep the status quo as it is. Whereas Mao had a very transformative agenda, right? And so famously in 1958, famously he wanted to catch up with Britain. He wanted to catch up with America in terms of production of steel, right? So that's not something that an emperor in the Ming Dynasty was thinking about, right? And he probably didn't even know that there was a Europe. So that was a agenda setting big difference. The communist China was far more ambitious, transformative, and aided by Leninist technique and organizational capacity. So I really don't want to say that communist China was a carbon copy of Imperial China, right? It had a lot of other elements borrowed from mostly from Soviet Union, and in terms of, think about the theory of the vanguard of the revolution invented by Vladimir Lenin. That is all about the ability of political elites to transform society very, very quickly, right? So Karl Marx famously predicted that communist revolution only happened after capitalism. Lenin said, no, we could launch communist revolution directly from feudalism. So that kind of transformative agenda was nowhere present during the Imperial China, but was very much the reality under Mao.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of contrast between Ming and Leninism and Mao is fascinating. You make this argument that like, look, Marco Polo, he shows up in Yuan Dynasty China, and he's completely blown away. He has these incredible diaries. He feels like he's been transported 500 years into the future. Whereas with Zheng He, like, they're going around, but like they feel like they're meeting these like backward tribal peoples who have no, culture or whatever. And it's interesting to me, to what extent this is overdetermined by China being quote unquote like ahead and more advanced and more developed. And it is harder to understand that you need to change and adapt and respond to the world if things feel like they're going pretty well and you have the largest empire on the planet. And maybe it's just something about human nature when you sort of, particularly when your elites feel like they're number one and they're sort of established and things are going okay, that they don't really feel like they need to do a whole lot of exploration and mind challenging things and having to grapple with the fact that maybe their system doesn't have all the answers. Whereas Mao, from the fall of the Qing to the Republican period to Mao, like he was, as you said, very conscious of the fact that China had messed up and that there needed to be a lot of catching up to do in order for the country to get its sea legs again.
No, I agree with you. I probably the factor I cited is one of many factors kind of pointing in the same direction. But even, given that discrepancy between the East and the West, 500 years ago, a century ago, I think it doesn't quite explain how clean China was in terms of deciding to be away from the rest of the world, right? So, could you have one Chinese individual who ventured to Africa and say, oh, could there be something beyond Africa, right? Is there another land that is different, right? So I think the mental kind of model that you summarize, it is probably a mental model of the political elites right? They went out and they didn't see anything kind of impressive, and they said, "Wow, what the heck, right? Let's just stay here." But I do believe that, you know, very often we are driven not by some grand perspective, agenda, macro, just want to find out what's going on, right? So there are plenty of people today who explore from rich countries to poorer countries just to see what's going on, right? So, and when Christopher Columbus, when he was exploring his sea voyages, he definitely had maybe a nationalistic agenda, but he was enticed by personal gains, personal motivations. He had something to gain from the success of his mission. That personal stake was completely missing in Zheng He's voyages. It was a purely national mission, a state-sponsored activity.
Yeah, I think that's sort of like that's the right comparison, is like if you look at European colonization in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, like, yes, like there wasn't a lot of respect that British civil servants or the Dutch East India Company had for the natives, but like they still brought scientists and people wrote about their experiences, and like that ended up sort of flowing back into the broader ecosystem, whereas it's just like, there's not a lot of that for a few thousand, for 1,000+ years when it comes to China. Anyways, Ilary, you want to take us back to Mao?
Yeah, well, I think the one really interesting thing is that so far there's one clear kind of package that in some mutated form Mao gets from imperial tradition, which is the autocratic tradition, and which I think we're probably inclined to see at least partially as a negative package. But then there is one thing which I think often is underappreciated, which is the level of human capital in terms of literacy, health that China has. And there's one of the most fascinating questions in comparative economics is the question of why China and not India. Why is China growing so much faster than India? And some people tend to say, well, maybe democracy doesn't really work when you have such a big country as India. Maybe you need to have autocracy like in China. You have quite a different take on that topic, which focuses much more on the human capital resources that China has. And I remember hearing you say, I think it was in your TED talk, that interestingly, China grows almost at the same pace or even faster than India, even during Mao, which suggests that this is not because of policy. This is despite of policy. That there's some kind of a push to growth in China, which you don't have in India. And you link that very much to literacy, especially. Am I right?
Absolutely. So the baseline judgment on China and India is based on almost just one data point that you can find on the website of the World Bank, which is the GDP per capita of China in, say, 1980 or 1990, and the GDP per capita of India during that period. It shows that India had a higher GDP per capita than China at that time. And then 20 years later, 30 years later, China's GDP per capita way surpassed India. So it was based on that data point that many people said, look at China, an autocracy, being able to grow very fast. Look at India, a democracy, not able to grow fast, and then China surpassed India. A couple of things wrong with that. One is that it's almost for sure that data is wrong. One of the problems with Chinese GDP data is that they had a Soviet system. It's called a material product measure that basically didn't include the service sector. In poor countries, you don't have industrialization, you have agricultural industrialization, And the third sector, which is pretty sizable, is the service sector. If you look at Indian economy, for many, many years, it was really the service sector that was very large.
But isn't it still true that China has, since the 80s, say that there's been a more dramatic transformation in China than in India?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And would you say that that's related to these same things that we've talked about? Especially, I mean, I was really struck when I heard what you said about literacy in India and in China, of just how dramatic differences there were even before the reform period, and how those might have been one of the fuel in China's economic tank that then made them grow fast.
So exactly, that's the point, right? So there are many, many differences between China and India. So the point I was making earlier disputes that initial discrepancy. But given that, you're absolutely true that China grew faster than India. It's actually very impressive if you believe that China was at a higher per capita base, and then it was still growing faster than India. All the way more impressive about China. I never deny that. But then there are so many other differences. How do people first jump to the conclusion it was because India was a democracy and China was not a democracy? So that I don't quite understand, right? There are so many. How do you know it was not something else? Then the way to do this is to look at global evidence to see, okay, at least now there are two competing hypotheses, and I would say three, but let me just concentrate on these two. One is human capital, and the other is the political system. Increasingly, academic literature shows that the autocratic and democratic systems don't really have a big impact on growth rate. Some autocracies grow very fast, like China and Taiwan in 1960s and 70s, Korea 60s and 70s. There are also really incredible failures, right? The Philippines, Indonesia, many African countries, these are all autocracies, and they failed fantastically, right? So this is the problem with the formulation of that idea by many Chinese and even some Western intellectuals. I have no problem with them saying China grew faster than India. That's a factual statement. I do have a problem when they escalate that statement to a statement about the system. Then they say autocracies grow faster. When you're talking about system, rather than a specific country, you got to have evidence on other countries that have the same system as China, right? I mean, that's just common sense. Right?
So where do you think that comes from then? Like, there's some Straussian reading of that, of going to this argument as option number one, right?
Well, so I mean, I think there are people who believe in autocracy, so they are grasping for evidence to show their belief actually has economic benefit. And I often point out to them, was China autocracy under Mao? You know, if they're honest, they will say yes. And then I'll ask the following up question, did China grow very fast under Mao, right? If they're honest, they say no, right? So at least even from the case of China itself, you have positive evidence that under Deng Xiaoping, Chinese autocracy grew very fast. And then you have the negative evidence under Mao, China under autocracy didn't grow very fast. Where do you draw the conclusion? An honest person will draw the conclusion is, maybe there's something else that's different between Mao and Deng, right? What would that be? Yeah. What would that difference be? Oh, maybe globalization has something to do with it. Maybe open policies had something to do with it. Maybe private sector development has something. And people don't point to that. And they point to the, I mean, it's just bunkers, right? So that that's why people who make that kind of argument, in my book, I pointed out this thing. If I invite them to a academic seminar, they cannot hold themselves up for 5 minutes because basic logic would demolish their view like that. And let me just point out that this is why I'm very unhappy, dissatisfied with media, because they go for these sensational statements. They typically do not examine the logic of people's views, right? So if you look at people who got, a lot of attention in the media, in the business conferences, it's not people like me, right? So I tend to lay out the logic, I tend to lay out the evidence. It is people who make sensational, overly broad statements. If you ask them, what is the logic, what is the evidence, they will do very, very badly. But typically, media don't ask them those questions.
Well, yeah. So, Professor, I was, I searched your name in Chinese to find some, Chinese language interviews of you. And there was, you've been interviewed about this book in English like 25 times in podcasts. And I only found one with Yuan Li. So maybe you just need to be the change you want to see in the world. Where's the Yasheng Huang YouTube channel podcast series?
Well, I'm not very good at that, for one thing. And for the other thing, to be fair to China, that's true. The Chinese interview is few and far in between. But that was not the case before. So before Xi Jinping, even in the first term of Xi Jinping, I did a lot of interviews, not about this book. This book just came out last year. I did a lot of interviews. With the Chinese social media outlets, I could actually go into great details about data and evidence, much, much more than I could with Western media. Cai Jing and Cai Xing, they will actually reproduce the kind of thinking process that is behind your point of view. And I was very, very impressed with the quality of the Chinese financial journalism. But now that's not the case anymore, right? So but that's not because the quality has gone down. It's just that the political environment has changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think also the one reason perhaps for the hyperbolic, it's because of autocracy conclusion is perhaps some Westerners have done a little bit of a favor there, because if you hear enough many times that autocracies cannot grow fast, and then you have an autocracy growing fast, it's very easy to instead of taking the reasonable middle point, autocracies can grow fast, you go into the opposite of, it is because we are an autocracy that we grow fast. And I think that would it be right to, say that basically you would say that there are certain conditions under which autocracies can grow fast, and one of the things that made it easy for China is the imperial legacy from the civil service exams, the Keju, which is very high literacy, very high human capital, in other ways to dramatically different than, for example, India. And another thing is that after Mao, you end up having a very interesting autocratic political environment, which is much more conducive to growth, because it's an autocracy, but it's not quite as top down, it's not quite as hierarchical. There's much more pluralism, diversity, scope than what it looks like if you look at it from the surface, right?
Yeah. So Hilary, that's a very good observation, and I'm in my current book. It's a revision of my 2008 book. I'm laying out that argument. The way I think to look at China, so now we move away from China-India comparison. If we just look at one country, either China or India, if you just look at the one country, the right methodology is to look at the movement rather than at the conditions. So which movement the country is engaged in? Is it the movement toward more openness, or is it the movement toward more closure? So it is not right to say that because China is not like a Western democracy, therefore it couldn't grow, or it could grow because it is not Western democracy. The right way to do that is looking at the movement of the East and the movement of the West. Is the East moving in an open direction or in a closed direction? Is the West moving in the open direction or in the closed direction? In statistical terms, it's called a diff in diff. It is that movement and the directionality of that movement that determines growth. So under Deng Xiaoping, it was an autocracy. There's no question about it, right? But it was moving away from Mao's totalitarianism, transforming China from a totalitarian society to an authoritarian society. Many Westerners probably dismiss that, who cares, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, what the heck is going on? To the people who live there, it makes a huge difference whether or not you live under a totalitarian society and authoritarian society. So the incentive effect comes from that movement. So in my current book, just imagine a would-be entrepreneur in 1978. That entrepreneur is not going to say, oh my God, China doesn't have a Bill of Rights. China doesn't have Western democracy. China doesn't have a Supreme Court, doesn't have separation of powers. Therefore, I'm not going to make investments in whatever watermelon seed business, right? The right mentality is, oh my God, in 1976, if I went into watermelon seed business, I would be arrested. In 1978, I'm not going to get arrested. I can sell my stuff on the streets. I can hire workers. The incentive effect came from that. The direction of the movement from 1976 to 1978 is toward more openness, toward more diversity, toward more predictability, right? So then we have to draw the conclusion. It is not because it was an autocracy that made that entrepreneur be willing to invest. It is because China was becoming less autocratic. Therefore, that entrepreneur was willing to make investment. As a policy question, then you have that policy question in front of you. Do I move the country more toward autocracy or away from autocracy, right? Even if my decision is not about, should I change my country to a democracy? I mean, that's not really the real question.
Can we take this back to your personal history? Like, if you were born 5 or 10 years earlier, do you think you would have, even wasted time learning English? Like how personally for you did, that change in like the slope of the angle, even if we're going from like 100 to 99 instead of like 100 to 101, in terms of your autocratic level, like how did that reflect in you personally in your youth?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of learning, and so this drive to acquire knowledge, in my own personal case, I was always interested in knowing more rather than in knowing less, no matter what the environment. So, and after I came to the U.S., I remember going to the library and just read, hours after hours about mostly the Western writings about China, what happened in China during the Cultural Revolution, what happened in China during the Great Leap Forward. Because when I was in China, I couldn't really get hold of that knowledge. So that drive was always there. And you could acquire that kind of learning better if you know English than if you don't know English. But in terms of business, right, motivations, business incentives, you kind of need to feel secure. That's just basic human instinct. And you need to have some basic level of feeling being secure in order to make your investments because investments cost money, investments cost time, right? If you know that once I make the investment, I'm going to be arrested instantaneously, then you're not going to make that investment, right? So in my book, I remarked that never underestimate the incentive effect of not being arrested. But many people don't pay attention to that. People say, oh, China doesn't have secure property rights law, right? And neglecting the fact that Deng Xiaoping increased the personal security of the Chinese by a huge amount. I couldn't quantify that, but by a huge amount. It was because of that Chinese entrepreneurs began to go into business.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the really interesting things, the era after 78 is really special, right? This is an era that I think I didn't really appreciate necessarily before reading your book, of just how different it is to everything else that has happened under CCP. First of all, one of the really striking things about China, because later is the big urban-rural gap that didn't really exist at the time. The rural areas were growing as fast as the urban areas. You have a lot of not parliamentarian pluralism, but you just have so many different voices within the party, all the way from the old school economic guard who implemented the 5-year plans under Mao, all the way to people like Zhao Ziyang, who very few people are able to really call a hard-blooded communist. So could you lived in China in the 80s still, did you? Or how you moved into the US? Because it would be just interesting to hear kind of your own personal experience also. What did it look like from the point of view of 80s to live under that period?
No, I came to the US for the first time in 1981. So I came
81, okay.
very early. But then I went back and I worked for the World Bank for one time in the 1980s. So I lived there. But it wasn't, I have to say that it wasn't from my own lived experience. I had exactly the same view as you, as many Western observers of China. Oh, actually, the more correct way to say it is I had exactly the same non-view of 1980s as many others until I began to work on my book that came out in 2008. So to go back a little bit, in 2003, I published a book on foreign direct investment, and foreign direct investment was critical in terms of driving Chinese growth in the 1990s, since 1990s. And then I finished that book with a question in my mind. Okay, so FDI was so important in the 1990s and ever since. What the heck was going on in the 1980s? What was driving Chinese growth in the 1980s? So based on that unanswered question in 2003, when I published my book on FDI, I began to look for answers. So after I finished my book on FDI, then it just left me with an unsatisfactory issue, right? Which is, okay, so if they were so restrictive of private entrepreneurship, and they didn't really have a lot of foreign investment, why did they grow like mad? More than 8%. It was really incredible. So that took me to my 2008 book, and my 2023 book summarized that part of the research. And then I found out in rural China, the reforms went way beyond agricultural reforms. We're talking about contracting reforms. We're even talking about land reforms. We're talking about village elections. We're talking about rural financial liberalization, which I had no idea about. And even today, I think 99.9% of the China scholars didn't know that there was a rural financial liberalization, right? It was just, and I went through thousands of pages of the government documents, and really because data on 80s are not very available, and China just went through Cultural Revolution. They demolished the statistical bureau, but they had good documents, right? And I was just blown away by how proactive the Chinese leadership was about rural financial liberalization. And we're talking about the head of the central bank, the head of Agricultural Bank of China, the head of Bank of China, the head of the construction bank, issuing support for rural financial liberalization. We're talking about large-scale financial institutions developing extremely fast in rural area in the 1980s, right? And the Western scholarship knows nothing about that period. And by the way, they don't care. There's no curiosity about that period. Even after my book was published, people say, what the heck, it's not that important. That affected 800 million people. China was 80% rural, 800 million people. And yet people just shrug their shoulders. Oh, okay, so what the heck, right? Every time I think about this, I just feel so frustrated and really sad, right? And then the overwhelming narrative is, oh, China can grow without financialization. China can grow with state-owned financial system, right? Without even any curiosity about the fact that was documented by thousands of pages of the bank documents, that was subsequently documented by statistical analysis that I did with Mei Juan Chen at Australian National University, right? And yet people just simply don't care.
Well, you made me very curious. So let me ask one question before we go into what happens next and why this trend does not, for example, continue. But I mentioned earlier that one of the interesting things about 80s is that it's not always just, oh, well, CCP decides to do this because they have a grand strategy. It's almost because there is no grand strategy often, because there is Deng Xiaoping versus Chen Yun, and there is Zhao Ziyang versus Li Xiannian. There is all of these kind of within-party power struggles. So when it comes to, for example, you said you've really looked into those documents. How much is it that everybody, in Beijing agreed, okay, we're just going to do this, versus how much was it like some of the liberals like Hu or Zhao was able to do this because there was just too many disagreements that no one kind of noticed in the old guard when they did it anyway? Like, how much was it a centralized decision versus some liberals were able to operate under the shadow of confusion, so to speak?
So people like Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang didn't wake up one day and said, oh, we got to have financial liberalization. It didn't happen that way. What is amazing about 1980s is at least twofold. There could be more. One, or threefold. One, you already talked about the political fragmentation at the very top. The second remarkable thing about that period is the policy ethos. The policy ethos was not GDP and that. It was economic growth benefiting tangibly the life of the people. As long as a policy, as long as a practice that improved the lives of the people, that's by definition the right policy, the right practice. Okay, so you have these small-scale sellers on the street in Beijing, right, selling whatever chickens and hogs and all sorts of stuff. That improved their lives because they derive some income from that. We should just do it, right? The other difference is sort of taking initiatives. And let me give you a concrete example. There was this incredible rural financial institution called the Rural Credit Foundation that was actually operating almost national in scale. The central bank didn't want to recognize that institution because they thought, it was private, it could disrupt the financial control. But they didn't really go out and stamp it out. And then the Ministry of Agriculture said, oh, if the central bank didn't recognize it, I will recognize it. I will give you the legitimacy, right? You can never imagine something like that happening in China today, or even in the 1990s China. That kind of local, kind of bureaucratic initiative that was there, that was the thing that created these practices. It wasn't Deng Xiaoping, it wasn't Zhao Ziyang, it wasn't Hu Yaobang. And Deng Xiaoping actually famously said, when he talked about the township and village enterprises, he said, and these are his original words, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party takes no credit for it. No credit for it. It was a total surprise to us, right? So essentially there was a space for these practices that happen organically and spontaneously. That almost all of that went away, especially in rural China after 1989.
So let's come to 1989 then. You have this concept of axiomatic legitimacy where, if you have 1,500 years of there being some emperor type figure ruling over the broader landmass that is China, everyone kind of expects that and like defers at some level to the legitimacy of the center, except on rare occasions when dynasties fall, or you have giant invasions of horse people or what have you. I'm curious, Professor, to what extent you thought it was baked in, that you would have some sort of counter-revolutionary reaction.
I don't think 1989 was baked in. I would concede that after 89, the way China moved was more likely than before 1989. So I will concede that point. But I don't think it was 100% determined and baked in. The axiomatic legitimacy, that's the idea that, kind of almost every culture starts with some sort of presumption, right? Western culture has its own presumptions. Chinese culture has its own presumptions. And the presumption, because of Keju, because of these thousands of years of autocratic rule, the presumption there is that whatever the government does is, one, legitimate. Secondly, it is good for your own welfare. You start with that view. You don't necessarily end with that view, but you start with that view. I would say that in 1980s and 1990s, they all started with that view. There's no difference. I mean, that's just axiomatic legitimacy view was alive in 1980s as it was in the 1990s and afterwards. The difference is that in the 1980s, you didn't have to end up with it. You could actually engage in the process of questioning, debates, and inquiries. And sometimes, you end up with the same view that you started out with. There's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes you don't end up with that view, right? Definitely that was something I was thinking about at that time. It's sort of, is it really true that everything the government does is good for you? So that occurred to me, sort of, I can't really pin down the day, but that began to occur to me, right? So whereas if you don't allow any discussion freedom, what Amartya Sen called the discussion democracy, what you started out with, you also end up with, right? And this is what's going on in China today, right? All these little pinkies and they never really have the mental habit of actually examining their views. They just proceed with it, and they actually actively refuse any opportunity to engage in a different mental process, and that's true of a lot of these young people from China in the West. Even though they live in the West, they still don't give up that axiomatic view.
But I mean, that's the real question, though, right? Is like, can you have a discussion democracy under a thing that calls itself the CCP? And is it okay to have little Yasheng Huangs running around in the 1980s thinking things where they don't end up believing that whoever's in power in Beijing has the right to, is just like on face legitimate? I mean, is it possible to have this, have a body that's running the country ultimately that is cool with this? Or was the 80s just some kind of, anomaly where you had the giant mess of Mao and people were asking questions for a little while until they saw what people asking questions led to, and then the system responded in the way it did?
Well, so I think I'm of two minds on that, whether or not 1989 was a inevitable result of this kind of looser autocratic system, or it was very much individual decisions and individual leaders' decisions, individual student decisions. So I'm sometimes I'm on one side of that view, and sometimes I'm on the other side of that view. But I do, I'm not a historian, but when I do read history, I am struck by the fact that very often history is moved by these individual events. And, clearly, if you look at Taiwan and South Korea, both of them had massacres of one way or the other, right? But they didn't decide to move in the opposite direction from the way that their economy was moving, the way their society was moving. They kind of decided, oh, okay, at some point, I got to give up. I got to give up the fight. I mean, I just sort of let it go, right? And today they are vibrant democracies, and I would argue that they are actually probably better performing on some dimensions than Western democracies. And I would argue Korean democracy and Taiwanese democracy, if you look at their performance during the pandemic, people trust their government, right? And the government said you should wear a mask, then people begin to wear masks. They don't really question everything that the government says, right? And, I was told by one scholar who visited South Korea, and she made a very interesting observation. There was this anti-government demonstration, but the whole demonstration was very well organized, very orderly, very, very, very well disciplined. So I'm of two minds on this issue. And if you look at the 1990s, was it really necessary for the regime to reject all the political reforms from not all of them, but the ones proposed by Zhao Ziyang? They rejected all of them. And then Hu Jintao essentially moved China even more toward the statist direction, and Xi Jinping moved it even more. I assign most of the blame to the leadership that came to China in 1989. I call them Shanghainese because they are Shanghainese. And as a person born and raised in Beijing, my view of Shanghai is colored by that. But I think here I'm speaking historical truth. China was taken over by the Shanghainese. And then they had this view that you don't reform the political system, you do globalization, you do privatization, and critically, you do the cities. You do the cities, right, rather than countryside. Their view of the countryside, very much a Shanghainese view, their view of the countryside is, oh, these are the burdens. The peasants, what can they do? They just grow rice and I eat their rice, but there's really nothing else they could do. They cannot possibly contribute to GDP growth. They cannot possibly contribute to technology development. So let's move the resources away from them to the cities, right? So that's kind of the China model that people now have of China: urban development, high tech, industrial policy, infrastructure. That was laid down by the Shanghainese takeover of the Chinese economy. Zhao Ziyang was gone, and a lot of these rural reformers were sidelined, marginalized because of Tiananmen.
Well, I mean, could I then push back a little bit on what you said earlier when you said that you don't think 1989 was that important, because it seems that it could be the most important thing, because what happens is that there is the old guard, the more conservative guard, who wants their way. Deng Xiaoping sits on the other side with the liberal reformers like Hu Yaobang, Zhao Ziyang, and it is only with the protests in Tiananmen Square that the more conservative side is able to put a wedge between the political and economic liberals and Deng Xiaoping, who seems to be more a political conservative and an economic liberal. And hence you get, first of all, you get the everything you just described, which I think is really interesting. But you get another thing which links back to something you mentioned earlier. You talked about the youth in China who are very, very intellectually, ideologically stubborn. And there are people who would claim that this is also a post-Tiananmen symptom, because what the government decides to do is basically say, look, what we have done is we've overemphasized economy, we've underemphasized ideological training, and you start getting a lot of new curriculums which emphasize national humiliation. There's a great book by a historian, I think Wang Zhong, it's I'll Never Forget National Humiliation, which talks about this exact process of how literally the term "never forget national humiliation" becomes a kind of classroom mantra that is Chinese children learn, and that this kind of the story of Chinese humiliation, the story of Chinese rejuvenation under the Communist Party becomes the way to basically say, we're never going to have at Tiananmen Square again as long as we just do this one right. We're going to tell all the kids of how horrible things were before, how great they are now, and how they should be very suspicious of foreign influence. And then we get the Xi Jinping era as a kind of almost natural progression of the two trends. One is the nationalism in the textbooks, and the other one is what you described as the the lack of political pluralism in the CCP.
Yeah, no. I if I was not clear, then I just want to clarify that. Absolutely, I believe 1989 was extremely important. Right? I actually think 1989 was more important than many scholars have acknowledged. They usually acknowledge the political significance of it. They don't know the economic significance of it. I actually laid out in the book, it's a revision of 2008 book, I laid out statistics to show that Tiananmen actually made an economic difference as well. I think the issue here is whether, so to use the term that Jordan used before, whether it had to turn out to be that way. Sort of counterfactually, did it have to turn out to be that way? There's a rumor, mostly among sort of the Chinese intellectuals, that Deng Xiaoping at one point was thinking of inviting Zhao Ziyang back. That was never confirmed. Maybe that was not true at all. But if it were true, if Zhao Ziyang chose to come back, did China need to go down that path that far away? So that was my observation. Is yes, it made a huge difference. But what I meant to say is that probably 90% of the chance that China should end up that way. But was there a 10% of the chance that the leaders were not hamstrung so much by 1989, and they still started reforms? So the examples that I cited, Taiwan and South Korea, They had the Kwangju massacre. They have the Taiwan had its own massacre. They kind of moved on, right? But maybe you need some distance from that. But Tiananmen happened a long time ago, and China is still sort of stuck in this Tiananmen mode. That, I think, is not completely determined, but largely determined, but not completely determined by Tiananmen. So I agree with you, but I just want to carve out some wiggle room in that scenario. Yeah.
Well, here's, I think, the key thing, bringing it back to your, lifespan argument earlier, is like, look, you get reform in Taiwan, you get reform in South Korea after the big guy dies. But the problem was, China, you had more people with charismatic revolutionary legitimacy, and they all lived so freaking long. I mean, if Deng and Chen Yun weren't around by the late 80s, you would have had more power in the slightly younger generation, which was a little more open to thinking differently about the political situation. And my little counterfactual is that had it happened in 1994 or when these guys were more incapacitated or just not on the scene at all, then maybe the balance of power within the system might have ended up a little differently. But even though Mao died, you still had people with enough belief in the old system and kind of charismatic credibility that they were able to get their way without the new generation being able to push themselves forward.
Yeah, so I agree with that analysis, and there was this kind of overlapping generation thing that you didn't have in Taiwan and South Korea. But what's interesting is also the fact that Cultural Revolution affected a lot of these revolutionary elders in a massively negative way. Yes, many of them were diehard conservatives, but a few of them were actually quite liberal, more liberal than the technocrats that came to the central government in the 1990s. They were willing to think about the issue in systemic terms, right? So that's how I define liberalism, which is that you think about a solution at a system level to deal with the problem rather than just thinking about it in terms of pure personality, change the leader and all of that. So look at Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, right? He was a liberal, not just in the sense that he supported liberalization, but he was making argument famously at a Politburo meeting that toppled Hu Yaobang. He was making a procedural argument. He argued that was not within the rules of the game that we agreed to, right? That was actually a revolutionary way of thinking in that type of system. I actually believe that is more revolutionary than the view that says, oh, market economy is good, democracy is good, right? This insistence on process, insistence on rules, what was more profound than economic liberalization. And she had that argument. But there were not that many people who argue that point. Ultimately he was defeated. But he was one of the revolutionary elders. So the lesson that China should have learned more from Cultural Revolution was that it was not just mistakes of Mao. It was the fact that the system allowed Mao to make those mistakes. And if you read the earlier documents reflecting on that period by the Chinese Communist Party, there was that reflection. There was that. So they actually instituted some sort of separation of powers, right? So the presidency was held by one person, party secretary, general party secretary was held by another person. They did institute some of that. But that lesson was completely forgotten after 1989 when they brought Jiang Zemin to Beijing and they were worried that Jiang Zemin was too weak. So let's abolish other centers of power and consolidate his power. And that path basically led to China today.
Okay, let's leave it at that today. In just a couple of days, I'll drop the final episode of this miniseries, which is going to be a brief history of China's present and future. Stay tuned. While you do, if you did like this episode and you think that there is a friend, family member, colleague who might also enjoy it, do share it, send it their way. And if you want to show some support, you can do it again, as always, by subscribing, hitting that 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you want to show some serious support, head to patreon.com/onhumans. But that's it for today. Hope to have you here again in a couple of days. Until then, take care.